June 18th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit us before the guards even ordered us off the truck. Warm bread, real butter, something rich and impossible drifting through the Texas heat. For a moment, none of us moved. After 3 years of eating with our hands, tearing at crusts like animals, surviving on soup so thin it reflected our faces, the scent alone felt dangerous. It was a reminder of a world we no longer belonged to. I stepped down last. My legs trembled from the voyage across the Atlantic, from the weeks in transit camps, from fear that seemed to live permanently now beneath my ribs. But the moment my boots touched the dusty ground of Camp Hearn, my senses froze. Ahead of us stood a long, low wooden building with screen doors swinging open and shut. From inside came the unmistakable sound of plates clinking, metal brushing against metal, chairs scraping across a clean floor. And then I saw them, set neatly on every table inside the mess hall. Forks, knives, spoons, not bent tin scraps or wooden paddles, real utensils, polished, symmetrical, civilized. It felt like seeing ghosts. We had not held a fork in 3 years, not since before the bombs, before the ration cards, before hunger turned our stomachs into burning knots. In Germany by the spring of 1944, even mothers with small children were lucky if they ate 700 calories a day. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Coffee was made from roasted barley. Meat existed only in memory. The war had squeezed everything out of us. Food, warmth, dignity. Yet here in the heart of Texas, the world seemed to operate by an entirely different logic. Behind the mess hall, white smoke rose from a chimney. Steady, calm, like a promise. Somewhere inside, a giant oven churned out bread the color of summer fields. I could almost taste the warmth of it on my tongue. Around me, the other women whispered as if afraid to wake a sleeping beast. "Do you see that?" one murmured. "They must be preparing food for their officers." "No," another said quietly, her voice thin with disbelief. I think it's for us." I almost laughed. For us? We were prisoners. Enemy women captured on French soil, dragged across an ocean. Beautiful tables and warm bread did not belong in our world. In our world, survival meant hiding turnips under coats, scraping burned pans for flavor, eating in silence so no one noticed how little was left. A guard motioned us forward, his voice firm but not cruel. "Inside, ladies. Keep moving." Ladies. The word hit me harder than the smell. No German guard had called us that in years. Inside, sunlight spilled across the tables, illuminating details I hadn't seen in so long. Cloth napkins folded in triangles, metal pitchers filled with water, bowls set out in orderly rows. To an American, this was ordinary. A simple lunchroom. But to us, it was like stumbling into a fairy tale no one had prepared us for. The United States in 1944 was living a different war. They were fighting overseas, yes, losing sons and brothers, but their homeland thrived with an engine the world had never seen before. Factories across the Midwest were producing 96,000 aircraft a year. Shipyards along both coasts launched 8 million tons of steel into the ocean. And in towns from Wisconsin to Texas, the morning began with bakeries firing up their ovens, and evenings ended with families grilling beef in backyards as if shortages were a myth. We had seen glimpses of that abundance during our train ride across the country, rows of supermarkets, farms stretching endlessly, warehouses overflowing. But it was here, in this mess hall, that abundance became personal, intimate, unsettling. A fork lay directly in front of my assigned seat. Its polished surface reflected my face, hollow eyes, skin drawn tight from years of rationing, hair brittle from malnutrition. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. My fingers wouldn't move. The fork felt like a weapon, like a test, like something I wasn't allowed to touch. "This cannot be for us," I whispered. But an American cook behind the counter, broad-shouldered, red-haired, humming something cheerful, glanced up and smiled at us as if we were guests arriving late to a family dinner. He turned strips of meat on a griddle, the fat sizzling in a way that made every cell in my body remember what hunger truly was. One of the women beside me clutched her throat. "They're trying to trick us," she said. "A table like this? Cloth napkins? What game is this?" None of us could answer. None of us knew a world where prisoners were fed from real plates. For the Americans, this was simply lunch, a normal day, a line in their routine. Soldiers and prisoners ate under the same roof, breathing the same warm air scented with bread and butter, as if war had not carved a canyon between us. But for us, especially for me, this room was the first impossible contradiction of captivity. A place that made no sense, yet somehow felt safe. A place where the enemy treated us with a dignity we had forgotten existed. As I stared at the fork, shimmering faintly in the afternoon light, one thought rose unbidden. If this is how they treat their prisoners, then what kind of country is this? And for the first time since my capture, curiosity pierced through the fear. Something inside me whispered that this place, this strange, abundant, orderly America, might change me in ways I could not yet understand. The moment I touched the fork, a tremor shot through me so sharply that I set it back down as if it had burned me. The mess hall noise faded into a distant hum, replaced by the pounding of my own heartbeat. Whatever warmth I had felt in that first bewildering moment was suddenly swallowed by something colder, older. Fear so deeply trained into us that it lived beneath the skin. And then the thought struck me like a slap. What if all of this was exactly what we had been warned about? For 3 years, that warning had followed us like a shadow. Since 1941, every radio broadcast, every military lecture, every whispered rumor in barracks carried the same message. Americans torture their prisoners. Americans starve them to death. Americans feed them scraps mixed with lye or poison. Americans are degenerates. Weak bodies, weak morals, weak minds. Those words had been repeated so often they had become a kind of dark scripture. I remembered sitting in a cold hall near Hamburg in 1942, our boots still muddy from drills, listening to an officer pacing before us. His voice was calm, almost bored, as he told us that capture meant humiliation, experimentation, and slow death. He said Americans pretended to be civilized only to lower the guard of foolish prisoners. I had believed him. All of us had. And now here I was, staring at a table set more beautifully than anything I had seen in years, wondering whether the napkins were real or bait. A plate of warm bread rested in the center of the table. The crust shone golden under the lamps. I did not trust it. I did not trust any of it. My throat tightened. Of course they would make the room look inviting. Isn't that what a trap is supposed to feel like? Beside me, Marlene leaned in close. "Don't eat too quickly," she whispered. "It could make us sick, or worse." Her voice trembled. Mine would have, too, if I could have spoken. America's abundance made no sense to us because our own world, only weeks behind us, had collapsed into something medieval. By 1943, German cities no longer had mornings. They had only sirens, only walls shaking, only dust drifting down like snow from ceilings cracked by bombs. I remembered the bakery 2 streets from our flat in Bremen, a place that once smelled of rye and cinnamon. In the early war years, people queued before sunrise just for a chance at a loaf. By 1944, the bakery had no flour left. Its ovens grew cold. They stayed cold. The day the owner boarded up the windows, children cried as though a family member had died. For many of them, it had been the last warm place in the neighborhood. At home, we hid our last bar of soap as if it were gold. My mother divided our meals with a precision that would shame a mathematician. If there was butter, which was rare enough to feel mythical, she gave hers to the youngest at the table. Most nights she drank only hot water. In 1944, dinner often meant 1 potato split among 3 people. When food became too scarce to pretend otherwise, we quietly put away our forks and knives. They rattled in the drawer. useless relics of a time when meals required tools. For children born during the war, a fork was an artifact from their mother's wedding chest, a symbol of a past they had never lived. I had not held one since 1941. No wonder my hands shook, and then there was this country, America, which seemed almost fictional in its stability. On the train ride to Texas, we had glimpsed pieces of it through the window. White farmhouses with porches, tidy rows of corn, milk bottles sitting peacefully on doorsteps waiting to be carried inside. I had seen an American mother opening her front door in her housecoat, bending to pick up her morning newspaper. She moved with an ease so foreign to me it hurt to look at her. The guards spoke casually of things that sounded like fantasies: breakfast tables with hot coffee, cast-iron skillets passed down through generations, children who drank milk every morning as if it were their right. To them, these were routines. To us, these were luxuries belonging to another universe. In Germany, the sky itself felt hostile. In America, even the air smelled of bread and soil. So when the cook inside Camp Hearn's mess hall smiled as he stirred something fragrant in a frying pan, my stomach twisted. The scent was too warm, too comforting. It reached into memories I had buried, memories of kitchens where light still fell through glass windows, memories of my mother brushing flour from her hands. The cook turned slightly, and for a moment our eyes met. His expression was open, friendly, almost apologetic, as if he understood exactly how frayed we were. That made it worse, because kindness was the one danger we had never prepared for. A guard behind us tapped the end of his pencil against the table. "Take your seats," he said. His tone was firm but not unkind. Every woman in our group stiffened. If they had yelled, if they had threatened us, if they had thrown food at our feet, that would have made sense. But this gentle arrangement of napkins and cutlery, this was unbearable. I swallowed hard, trying to remember what the propaganda lectures had told us to do if captured. Do not trust American food. Do not trust American smiles. Do not trust American generosity. They said Americans pretended at hospitality because deception was easier than discipline. Sitting before that table, I almost believed it again. "Helga," whispered Elsa from across the table. "Why would they give us all this? Why us?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. The truth was, I did not know. Everything I saw contradicted everything I had been taught. The cloth napkins, the clean plates, the soft murmur of American soldiers talking quietly at a nearby table. No shouting, no threats, just ordinary conversation. It felt like stepping into someone else's memory. One of the women began to cry softly. Another hid her hands beneath the table so the guards wouldn't see them shake. The room didn't feel hostile. Not at all. But fear clung to us like damp wool. We carried it in, and it followed us, even into this place that smelled of butter and sunlit floors. I looked around the mess hall once more and felt a tightening in my chest. It was too ordinary to be safe, too generous to be real. Everything in me whispered that something must be wrong. But nothing was wrong. And that was the most frightening part. I had expected the fear to tighten its grip the longer we sat in that mess hall, but something far stranger happened instead. The room did not close in on us. The guards did not turn cruel. The food did not disappear. The danger, it turned out, was not harm, but kindness. Kindness repeated so steadily, so effortlessly, that it began to erode everything we thought we knew. And it started with something as small as a chair. A tall American soldier with a sunburned neck approached our table. His boots thudded gently on the wooden floor, and when he reached the empty space beside me, he did something none of us were prepared for. He pulled out a chair, not for himself, for me. "Have a seat, ma'am," he said, as though I were a guest in his mother's kitchen. I froze. It felt wrong to sit while a soldier stood. German discipline had trained us to expect shouting, not courtesy. But the soldier simply waited, one hand on the chair, expression mild and patient. No rush, no threat, just an invitation. I lowered myself onto the seat, stiff and uncertain, and he pushed the chair in lightly before stepping away. It was such a small gesture, yet for a prisoner who had slept on floors, eaten standing in lines, and endured orders barked at her daily, the politeness cut deeper than any weapon. Marlene leaned toward me, her voice trembling. Why would he do that? I didn't know. I couldn't even guess. Then came the cook, the red-haired Texan we had seen earlier, emerging from behind the counter with a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been feeding hungry people all his life. He carried a plate of sliced bread to our table, set it down gently, and studied our faces for a long moment. "You gals need help with anything?" he asked. His accent was warm, rounded, almost musical. We stared back at him in silence. Finally, he picked up a fork from beside my plate, held it the way a teacher might hold chalk, and said, "Been a while since you used one of these, huh?" Heat flooded my cheeks. He wasn't mocking us. He wasn't pitying us. He was acknowledging a truth without shame. He demonstrated, slowly, how to hold the fork and knife, how to steady the meat, how to cut without sawing. His movements were quiet, respectful, almost fatherly. For the first time in years, I realized someone was teaching me how to eat again, not as an animal scavenging scraps, but as a person. I swallowed the tightness in my throat. "Thank you," I murmured in halting English. "Any time," he said, tapping the table lightly before walking away. Our table of women ate slowly at first, not from distrust, but from disbelief. Hunger guided our hands, yet hesitation lingered. Habits of scarcity were not so easily shed. I began to tear my bread in half, ready to share it with Marlene out of instinct. But before I could, a young soldier, no more than 19, passed by and noticed. He paused. "You don't have to split that," he said gently. Then he returned a moment later with a full basket of bread and set it beside us. "Eat what you need," he added. "We've got plenty." We've got plenty. No words had ever felt more foreign. In Germany, plenty had vanished from our vocabulary years before. The soldier lingered just long enough to see the shock on our faces. Then, embarrassed by his own kindness, he scratched the back of his neck and hurried off. It was such an American gesture, awkward in its sincerity, earnest in its decency, that it carved its way into my memory. Later, I would learn something I did not understand that day. The United States was one of the few nations that treated the Geneva Convention not as a guideline, but as a moral obligation. Their leaders believed firmly that how they treated enemy prisoners reflected the character of the nation, and perhaps more importantly, every American soldier captured in Europe depended on this principle being honored in return. To Americans of that era, power was not proven by cruelty. It was proven by restraint, by control, by dignity. Their commanders taught them, strength without mercy is weakness. Strength with mercy is American. That was the unspoken philosophy shaping every interaction we saw. Every piece of bread, every quiet gesture, every moment when a guard chose patience over force. This was not softness. This was a deliberate choice to uphold a moral code even in war. And watching it unfold around me, I felt something loosen inside. A knot I didn't know had formed. A stainless steel spoon lay near my plate, shining under the overhead lamps. I stared at it, mesmerized. I had forgotten what polished metal looked like. In Germany, spoons had become dull, bent from use, sometimes replaced altogether with wooden ladles. "This must be for the officers," I whispered without thinking. "No," Elsa murmured. "This is for us." I didn't believe it until a guard walked past and nodded politely, as though it were perfectly natural that enemy women should eat from clean utensils. Across the room, another prisoner struggled to cut her meat. Her hands trembled so violently that the knife scraped the plate. A soldier noticed and approached her slowly, hands visible, careful not to startle her. "No rush, ma'am," he said softly. "You're safe here." Safe. We had forgotten the meaning of the word. She lowered her utensils and covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. The soldier did not touch her. He simply stood nearby, giving her space, giving her dignity. That quiet patience felt like sunlight after years of winter. Everywhere I looked, small acts of kindness accumulated like snow until the entire room felt transformed. A guard refilling water glasses before they were empty. Another adjusting a window to keep the room cool. A soldier stepping aside so prisoners could pass without fear. The cook humming a tune from a distant radio. The smell of bread drifting through the rafters like a memory of home. These moments were not dramatic. They were not heroic. They were normal. But that normalcy, after everything we had endured, felt miraculous. This was America's power in 1944, not only its factories or its military, but its quiet belief that humanity should not collapse just because the world did. If any American today had stepped into that mess hall, into that single, unremarkable lunch, they might have seen nothing but routine. But for us, the simplest gestures were revelatory. And if the Americans of that time had a secret, it was this. They treated enemies as human beings because they believed America was strong enough to do so. That confidence, steady, moral, rooted in decency, became the thread that pulled us back toward our own humanity. I looked around the table at the other women, crumbs clinging to their fingers, faces softening with the first warm meal in years. Against my will, against everything I had been trained to believe, the truth settled over me. This kindness was not an accident. It was their way, and no amount of propaganda could disguise that for long. I had thought the kindness would get easier to accept the longer we sat there, but kindness, when you have lived too long without it, does not comfort you at first. It breaks you, and it does not break you loudly. It breaks you the moment your hands try to return to a life they no longer remember. It happened when I lifted the fork again. The cook had shown me how to hold it. The women around me were eating slowly, cautiously, trying to relearn motions we had forgotten. For a moment, I almost believed I could do the same. I steadied my breathing, pressed the knife gently into the meat, and tried to guide the fork the way he had demonstrated. But my fingers would not obey. 3 years of grasping crusts with bare hands. 3 years of scraping bowls for the last drop. 3 years of eating so quickly a soldier wouldn't strike you for lingering. My hand trembled violently. The fork slipped from my grip and hit the plate with a sharp, ringing kenk that cut through the room like shattered glass. Every conversation around us went silent. Dozens of American soldiers turned their heads. A few prisoners froze, forks halfway to their mouths, and I did the one thing I had promised myself I would not do. I broke. I don't remember. My voice cracked into a whisper no louder than breath. Then, louder, as something inside me gave way. I don't remember how to eat like this anymore. The words trembled into the still air, bare and unbearably human. My chest tightened. My throat closed. Hot tears spilled before I could stop them. I covered my face with both hands, ashamed. Not because of the soldiers, not because of the other women, but because a fork, a simple piece of polished metal, had shown me how much of myself the war had stolen. Across from me, Marlene reached out and pulled me against her shoulder. She, too, was trembling. This breakdown, the sobbing, the shaking, the fork clattering, was not from pain. It wasn't even from hunger. It was from the unbearable weight of gentleness. When you are treated kindly after years of fear, your body doesn't know how to receive it. It rejects it first, like a foreign substance. It fights it, mistrusts it, pushes it away. Because kindness means safety. And safety means everything you endured before was needless cruelty. And that truth alone can crush you. All around us, the Americans did not laugh. They did not stare in judgment. They did not whisper mockingly to one another. They simply watched, quietly, with a kind of collective understanding I could not comprehend. No German officer had ever paused to understand us, but here, the enemy did. I did not see him approach. Only when he knelt beside me did I realize someone had moved. He was young, maybe 19, with broad shoulders, sunburned cheeks, and eyes the color of the wheat fields I would later learn he grew up on. His uniform bore dust from morning drills. His hands were rough from farm work, not from cruelty. He spoke gently, his accent soft and rolling like the plains. My mama taught me, hungry people don't need judgment, they need food. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He wasn't quoting orders. He wasn't offering military doctrine. He was offering the values he had been raised with, the same values that filled American kitchens and barns and schoolhouses long before the war began. A piece of his childhood had crossed a battlefield, an ocean, and a barbed wire fence, just to land in front of a trembling foreign woman who didn't know how to hold a fork. He offered me a napkin, not with pity, with respect. "Take your time," he said quietly. "Nobody here is rushing you." Something in his voice, steady, sincere, impossibly warm, broke the last defense I had left. I leaned into Marlene's shoulder and sobbed, not in fear, not in humiliation, but in a grief so deep it almost felt like relief. As I cried, something else surfaced, something far more painful than hunger or exhaustion. I realized I had never been treated like this in my own country. Not by officers, not by supervisors, not by the men who claimed to fight for our fatherland. In Germany, kindness had been rationed even more tightly than food. But here, the enemy placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Another soldier quietly refilled my water glass, not drawing attention. The Texan cook watched from across the room, his expression soft as though wishing he could shield us from our own memories. And the Kansas boy, this gentle stranger, remained beside me until my breathing steadied. When I finally lifted my head, eyes blurry, he offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said. Then, slower, as if making a promise, "Eat. No one will hurt you." It struck me then that fear does not disappear in a single moment. Sometimes it melts slowly, drip by drip, the way winter gives way to spring. But kindness, especially the kind offered by people with no reason to give it, has a way of cutting through the hardest armor. The fork lay on the table, still glinting under the lights. I picked it up again, and though my hand trembled, it did not tremble alone. Marlene's hand rested over mine. The Kansas boy stayed near. The cook watched from his station as if making sure I wouldn't fall apart again. This time, I held the fork steady, and something inside me, something small and fragile, something I thought the war had killed, opened its eyes again. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope. I thought the breakdown would humiliate me. Instead, it freed me. Because when the tears finally stopped and the room settled back into its quiet rhythm, something new took their place, something sharp, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. A question that rewrote my entire understanding of the world. It arrived not with fear, but with clarity. The Kansas boy had returned to his post, though he kept glancing over as if making sure I was steady. Marlene still held my hand beneath the table. My fork lay where I had placed it, no longer trembling. And in that moment of stillness, I found myself thinking, why? Why are they treating us like this? Why? More gently than our own officers ever did. That thought frightened me more than the fork, more than the meal, more than the kindness itself, because it meant admitting something dangerous. The war had lied to us. Lied about America, lied about its people, lied about what strength truly meant. I looked around the mess hall, sunlight slipping between the slats of the windows, catching on polished plates and steam rising from food. No brutality, no degradation. If this was the enemy, what did that make the world I had come from? For the first time, the question formed fully, painfully. If they treat their enemies like this, How must they treat their own people? I wasn't ready for the answer, but it came anyway. The next hours unfolded like a window being opened onto a life I had never been allowed to see. A group of soldiers near the doorway lounged casually, sharing a pack of chewing gum. Not rationed, not traded, simply offered from one hand to another. They laughed the way young men do when the world is still wide and open to them. One joked about the heat, another about missing real coffee, and the third pulled out a small metal tin he carried everywhere. I recognized the sound of its clasp as he opened it, the soft click of a cherished object. Inside was a photograph. The soldier angled it toward the others with pride. A woman in a floral dress stood in front of a white picket fence, smiling in a way only someone safe can smile. A little boy hugged her leg. Small dog jumped at his feet, ears flopping. The soldier pressed his thumb gently over the woman's face. "That's Mary," he said to his friends. "Got this taken the week before I shipped out." Mary. Not the homeland, not the Führer, not some impossible ideal. Just Mary, his wife, his family, his reason for being decent even in war. I could not fathom it. German officers did not show us photographs of loved ones. They showed us maps, speeches, death tolls recited like boasts. But here was this young man, thousands of miles from home, holding on to the picture of a woman in a sundress as though the ink itself protected him. These men did not serve ideology. They served life. And that realization rattled something loose inside me. After the meal, we were escorted outside to the yard for a short break in the shade. The Texas sun was merciless, but the air smelled of cedar and distant cattle. A wholesome scent, untouched by war. Across the yard, a soldier sat on an overturned crate, sipping from a tin mug. He poured some of the steaming liquid into a spare cup and offered it to another prisoner nearby. "Try it," he said. "Ain't nothing fancy, just coffee." The prisoner hesitated, then took a sip. His eyes widened in astonishment. Real coffee. Not barley, not scorched acorns. Real, dark, bitter coffee. I watched that exchange and felt another truth settle over me. Kindness here was effortless. Like breathing. Like water in a deep well. Like the way America itself seemed to move. Quiet, confident, unconcerned with cruelty. And in contrast, the world I had come from seemed suddenly unbearable in its harshness. I remembered Germany. Bombed streets where dust and smoke lingered long after the raids ended. Children picking through rubble for nails to sell. Homes with broken windows covered by cardboard patches. Lines for bread that ended with exhausted women walking home empty-handed. Mothers eating nothing so their children might have a little more. Fathers growing thin while insisting they were not hungry. Everything ruled by fear, of authorities, of hunger, of silence, of tomorrow. And yet here in this country that had every reason to hate us, there were. Breakfast tables filled with eggs and bacon. Friday night diners serving pie and milkshakes. Apple orchards heavy with fruit. Families gathering for Sunday dinners. Children with full stomachs and clean clothes. Women who could walk in daylight without sirens or soldiers ordering them inside. It was not just another nation. It was another possibility for human life. The more I observed the Americans, the more one truth became undeniable. Strength, for them, was not about dominance. It was about decency. It was about choice. It was about the freedom to be gentle even when history expected brutality. We had been told kindness was weakness. But here, kindness looked like confidence so complete it needed no cruelty to defend itself. It hurt to realize this. It hurt because it exposed Germany's lies. It hurt because it showed how deeply we had been misled. But it also healed something in me. Something small and trembling that had survived the war without my knowing. Hope, not hope for survival. Hope for humanity. I watched a soldier pick up a fallen baseball from the dirt, toss it lazily toward another, and laugh when he missed the catch. The sound carried across the yard like a reminder that life, real life, still existed somewhere beyond the rubble of Europe. I whispered to Marlene, hardly recognizing my own voice. Everything they told us. Everything we believed. It wasn't true. She nodded slowly, eyes shining with the same dawning understanding. The America we had been taught to fear did not exist. The America standing before us was something else entirely. A nation of contradictions, yes, but also of generosity, dignity, and quiet moral power. A nation strong because it chose to be kind. And as the sun beat down on that dusty Texas yard, warming my face and my trembling hands, I realized something I would carry for the rest of my life. The war had taken much from me. But America, unexpectedly, impossibly, was giving something back. Something I had thought impossible. A belief in goodness again. For weeks after that first meal, I carried the same unanswerable question with me like a stone in my pocket. How could the enemy give back pieces of my humanity when my own country had stripped them away? It followed me through the camp yard, through work details, through quiet evenings when the sun dipped behind the Texas plains and painted the sky in colors I had never seen in Germany. And it followed me long after the war ended, across oceans, across decades, across the silence of remembering. But the strangest part came years later, when I realized the story wasn't mine alone anymore. After the war, I returned to a Germany unrecognizable. Cities were skeletons, families scattered or gone, ration lines still stretched around corners. In that broken landscape, the story of America lived inside me like a hidden ember, warm, persistent, fragile, and impossibly bright. The day I first told my children, they were sitting at our small kitchen table, legs dangling above the floor, eyes wide with curiosity. They asked, "Mama, were the Americans cruel?" And I surprised myself with how quickly the answer came. Cruel? No. The Americans fed us like family. I watched confusion cross their faces, then wonder. They had grown up hearing stories of bombings, of hunger, of Nazi cruelty, of Soviet brutality. But kindness, unexpected, undeserved, unwavering, this they had never imagined. I told them about the fork, about the Kansas boy, about the cook with the soft humming voice, about the soldiers who shared chewing gum and stories of home, about how kindness had broken me, and then remade me. My daughter leaned in closer. So the enemy was kind? No, I told her, softly. They were American. Years later, when my children had children of their own, they asked me to tell the story again, and again, and again. Every time I ended the same way. Remember, we survived not because of Germany's strength out of obligation, but conviction, that treated enemies with more dignity than many nations treat their own. Because that America exists still, not in governments or headlines, but in the stories families pass down, in the letters preserved in drawers, in the memories of POWs like me. The legacy of that kindness did not stay in Texas. It crossed the ocean with us. It shaped our children. It softened hearts hardened by propaganda, and it taught generations of Germans that mercy is not weakness. It is greatness. In the years after the war, as my life rebuilt itself, piece by fragile piece, I often found myself looking back toward Texas, not toward the barbed wire or the barracks, but toward that mess hall where a trembling hand dropped a fork and a nation revealed its soul. And now, as an old woman watching the world change faster than memory can keep up, I sometimes wonder what America sees when it looks at itself, because I know what I saw in 1944, and what I saw was a country that believed goodness was worth defending. When I speak to American audiences today, I feel a tension in the room, a quiet longing, a private ache. People tell me, we don't recognize our country anymore. And I understand what they mean, because the America I met in 1944 was a nation certain of itself, a nation that built ships faster than they could be sunk, a nation whose factories lit up the sky through the night, their smokestacks breathing steel and hope into the air, a nation that fought a world war but fed prisoners with fresh bread and real butter. Today, many Americans look around and see something different, political division instead of unity, Factories shuttered instead of roaring. Fear in headlines instead of generosity in daily life. I am not American by birth, but I mourn that loss with you, because I knew a version of America that carried its morality like a torch. The America of 1944 did not measure strength by cruelty. It measured strength by character, and it showed that to a frightened woman who didn't remember how to hold a fork, people sometimes ask me, "What did America teach you?" And the answer has never changed. The America I met in 1944 was strong because it was kind, not kind out of weakness, not kind out of naivety, kind because it believed deeply, almost stubbornly, that mercy was a form of power. That is what set this nation apart. When American soldiers fed their enemies, they weren't just offering meals, they were offering proof. Proof that decency survives war. Proof that compassion outlasts fear. Proof that the values of a free people cannot be bombed into silence. I tell Americans today, you fed your enemies, and that kindness fed generations. I am one of those generations. My children are too, and now their children. And every time someone tells me, my grandfather guarded POWs, or my father always said they treated prisoners with respect, I feel the same warmth rise in my chest. Pride, not mine, but yours. Pride that you deserve to feel. Pride in the greatest generation who taught the world a truth often forgotten. Mercy is power. There is one thing I kept from Camp Hearn. Not a letter, not a photograph, but because of America's mercy. I was not the only one who carried such memories. In the years following repatriation, German POWs wrote hundreds of letters to American families, ranchers, camp guards, local churches, anyone who had treated them with decency when the world expected cruelty. Some letters thanked American cooks, some thanked the soldiers who taught them English, some thanked ranchers in Texas for giving them honest work and warm meals. Some thanked the guards who looked away while prisoners carved toys for local children. One letter, written by a man I had met in Camp Hearn, became famous in a small Texas town. He wrote, "You treated us not as enemies, but as men who had lost their way." The family who received that letter kept it framed on their mantel for 3 generations. Another woman, whose father had worked as a guard in Arkansas, once told me during a gathering of former POW descendants, "My dad never talked about medals or battles, but he always talked about the prisoners. He said, 'I hope someone treated their sons the way I treated those boys.'" That was the America we had met, an America that believed kindness traveled farther than bullets. Whenever I share my story publicly now, American audiences react the same way. Some wipe their eyes quietly, some smile with pride, some whisper to the person beside them, "Grandpa was at Camp Hearn," or "Dad told me they always followed the Geneva Convention," or "That was America at its best." People come up afterward and say, "My grandfather guarded POWs in Texas. He always said they deserved respect." My mother grew up near a camp in Louisiana. She remembered German prisoners singing Christmas carols. I wish the America of today still believed what America believed back then. And I understand their nostalgia, because I feel it too. The America I encountered in 1944, the America that handed a fork to a shaking prisoner, the America that believed a hot meal was stronger than any ideology, the America that taught decency even in war, was a nation that carried its morality like a flag. Not a perfect nation, but a profoundly good one. And goodness, I learned, is its own kind of power. Now, decades later, as I sit at my kitchen table, older hands holding the same fork I once dropped in a mess hall in Texas, I realize the truth of what I lived. The war taught me fear, but America taught me dignity. What remains is not the hunger or the humiliation, but the memory of a nation strong enough to feed the people it fought. When I speak to American veterans or their families, I always end with the same words shaped by a lifetime of gratitude. Your fathers didn't just win a war. They upheld a moral code that saved lives, including mine. I hope they feel what I felt the first time I tasted real bread in Camp Hearn. I hope they remember the America that believed kindness was strength, that followed the Geneva Convention, not a fork, the same fork that slipped from my trembling hand, the same fork a Kansas boy taught me to hold again, the same fork that marked the first time in years I felt like a human being. It sits now in my kitchen drawer, old, scratched, a little bent. But when my granddaughter asked about it one afternoon, I took it out gently and placed it on the table between us. She traced its worn edges with her finger. "Why did you keep this, Oma?" I looked at her safe hands, her full cheeks, her bright eyes, everything I had once thought the world would never allow again. And I told her, this fork saved me, because behind it stood a nation that refused to hate. I watched her eyes widen, the way mine had in that Texas mess hall so many years before, and I realized something. Even now, even in a world that feels uncertain and divided, the legacy of America's kindness still lives. In stories, in families, in memories, in the quiet truth passed from one generation to the next. A nation is not its politics. It is not its arguments. It is not its headlines. A nation is the sum of the people who choose, again and again, to act with dignity when cruelty would be easier. That was the America I met in 1944, and I believe with every beat of my aging heart that this America still exists, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be lived again.